Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski. Thanks for being with me. And joining me from the great Republic of Texas is my colleague and friend Neil Chatelain. Neil, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing pretty good, Chris. How are you?
I am well, thank you very much. And I'm really glad to have you with us tonight because you've got some great reading material for us, as I understand it.
That's right. My latest book has just hit the shelves, so to speak. It's
Treasure and Empire and Civil War. That sounds like either a great Victorian melodrama or, I suppose, a Victorian era Civil War melodrama.
it's you can't go wrong with gold anywhere, and everybody likes money, so it's a pretty good catch-all for all that kind of stuff. It's pretty good.
So this is a book that has been published by McFarland Press, and it tells a really great sort of military and economic Civil War story.
Yeah, so the idea behind it was to link the military, economic, naval side, the diplomatic side, all sort of in this one big network, while simultaneously focusing on some naval aspects that really aren't talked about at all, even in the naval circles of the Civil War community, while also synthesizing that and bringing it together with sort of the latest historiography for the last couple of decades regarding the war in the far west.
Now, you're a Navy guy, so I'm assuming that's how you got plugged into this story. But tell me how you found your way into this tale.
Yeah, I wrote a paper that I delivered at a conference about the ironclad Stonewall, which is the Confederacy's only ironclad built in Europe that got to sea. And one of the things that was in the orders for this Confederate ironclad in 1865 was to capture these ships full of gold. The other part of the orders were to attack New York City simultaneously and to attack William T. Sherman's supply base in Savannah, Georgia, and a whole bunch of other stuff.
Wait,
Uh,
you got to parse that out for me because New York City and Savannah don't seem like they're close together. And then when you just say capture the ships full of gold,
right,
that
yeah. Obviously, the captain of that ironclad had some discretionary orders to do what he thought best, but basically he had this guidance of pick one and see what you can accomplish. And by the time the ship got across the ocean to the Bahamas and then to Cuba, Jefferson Davis was already in U.S. custody, and the armies were surrendered by then. So it just surrendered. But at the conference, the moderator of the panel I was on brought up that as like capture gold and attack New York simultaneously. Like the Confederacy seems to not even be with it anymore with their orders, and it kind of stuck with me. And then combine that with some pop culture references like the good, the bad, and the ugly. They're searching for gold in this movie. And then David Poyer, the guy who writes a lot of historical sea fiction, he
who
wrote a
is from my hometown, I want to tell you.
how
Oh,
about that?
yeah,
That's not bad.
that's right. David Poyer is from my hometown,
I didn't know that.
Bradford, Pennsylvania.
So he wrote a trilogy of Civil War books, and the middle book in the trilogy is this Confederate commerce raider, and the climax of that book is the ship trying to capture one of these merchant ships carrying gold to New York City. So I had all this, I had actual orders, and I had some pop culture references, and I was in my research methods class for grad school, and it's a standard research methods for history class, and they were just like write a paper about whatever you want, prove that you can do archival research. And so I picked this as my topic and went with it, and it turned out to be a lot more than just some 20 something page research paper.
Obviously, you've got a book out of it, right?
Absolutely.
I've got it. I'm still sort of fixed on this capture the ship full of gold. That sounds like the plot of one of those 1960s Disney movies, the live action Disney movies, and like
Yeah, it's
maybe
almost
Don
like
Don Knotts is in it, like,
it's almost Bond-esque in some ways, but it's true. So the United States had a network of ships that it's called the Panama Route, and there was another one in Nicaragua, and another one in Mexico as well. But the idea is these are the ships that are carrying people from New York City and the Atlantic seaboard down to the Panama Isthmus, and then people cross the Panama Isthmus and then take another ship up to San Francisco. And that's how people are getting to California with the gold rush. Everybody thinks of like the Oregon Trail and the California Trail and this covered wagon route. And that's true. There were a lot of people that did this covered wagon route. The numbers actually are that about 250,000 people did the covered wagon route. Well, the numbers are also at the same time that about 250,000 people crossed by water on the Panama route, and another 50,000 crossed via Nicaragua doing the same thing. So what we have here is the primary means for people to travel west. And it starts right after the gold rush begins. It's because they're trying to set up the official mail route to the Pacific coastline. Our first transcontinental railroad gets built here in Panama by the U.S. government, well, not the U.S. government, but by New York businessmen. It's William H. Aspinwall who finances that.
And because of course the continent at that point is much more narrow, but it's super mountainous down through there. So it's not like it's just a little easy, straight, flat shot.
No, it's the Panama Canal is alongside that railroad, which is still in operation today, and it took them almost 5 years to build the railroad through these mountains, and thousands of immigrants, Chinese immigrants and immigrants from Jamaica and American immigrants died building this railroad. But you could transport people across the Panama Isthmus in one day after it was built. And after all these people get to California, well, they're sending mail back through the ships on the return trip, but they're also sending gold back on the return trip as well. So companies like Wells Fargo and Company and so on, they're putting the gold on these ships, getting them to New York City, and then the gold is being infused with all the New York business elite, the New York Stock Exchange, and everything there. So it's a major factor in the U.S. economy that people just don't really talk about.
And of course, gold being hard currency at the time, super useful to physically have it on hand. What sort of challenge did that create in transporting it from the West Coast through Central America up to New York?
So originally, it was kind of a free for all, and people were just ad hoc doing it. By the time our Civil War starts, it's very systematized. There's one company, the Atlantic and Pacific Mail Company, that's run by Cornelius Vanderbilt, and that gets people to and from New York to Cologne, Panama. And then William H. Aspinwall's Panama Railroad Company transports people. And there's another company, the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, that transport people back and forth from Panama City up to San Francisco. And so it's all very organized. There's 3 trips up and down the coast by 3 steamers on each side of the coastline per month. And so they actually are timed to meet in Panama at the same time. And then they just cross, and the ships are only in port for about 3 days, and then they go back up. And the entire trip, so like the Oregon Trail takes 3 to 6 months. This trip takes 3 weeks.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. But it costs more money to do this. Like getting passage on these ships is expensive. So it's people choosing to go the easy route, so to speak. But getting the gold back, once things became systematized, was actually pretty easy. They advertised how much gold was in the newspapers, was on each ship, and which companies owned all the gold that was coming on each ship, and all that. So it was very out there, which is interesting because, well, who's reading the newspapers in 1861? Everybody. And so people, there's a newspaper clipping, I think it's literally like April 20th, 1861, in the New York Herald that says, does anybody else notice that these ships are carrying gold and have no guns on them? And there's now this thing called the Confederacy.
Yeah.
And so right from the beginning of the war, it's a problem that people are looking at.
So I'm still thinking about you say people are paying the easy route, and this is like buying your easy pass, I suppose. Right? So I'm thinking about, today where you've got armed security guards, you've got armored cars, transporting money is a high security event. And here you're saying you've got these boats with no guns. What sort of security was involved in this route before the war even started? Because, it seems like it would be easy to just hold up a train, again, sort of in 1960s Disney movie fashion. But like you could just hold up a train and get this gold.
So the Panama route had no security on the ships, so to speak. There wasn't really a security element, but the railroad had security guards at the train depots, and there were people riding the train cars, the rail cars, as security, sort of like people rode stagecoaches with their shotguns and everything as well. But the ships didn't really have much protection at all before the war, and that's something that the ship owners and the businessmen basically called the U.S. government out on in April 1861. There's letters signed by 30 different companies representatives, and they're like, are you going to protect us or not? Because we've got a lot of money here. And by a lot of money, the numbers are pretty striking. So to give you some actual physical numbers here, the US government's budget in 1860 is $63 million. The US government's treasury reserves of gold is $72 million. And in 1860, on this Panama route, they transported $36 million in gold, the equivalent of half the US Treasury is transported in 1 year.
Now, on one hand, I could see like, oh, here you've got these rich businessmen saying, help cover our private interests. But on the flip side, like this is a significant financial impact on the US government because of the hard currency situation. So how is it that the government decides like, well, yes, this is a security issue that deserves our attention?
So early in the war, the businessmen call for a naval convoy. They say the U.S. Navy needs to escort these ships carrying gold, and the U.S. Navy's response is, "We don't have the ships for that." And so a series of ad hoc measures are taken instead in 1861 and 1862 to protect these ships carrying all this gold. So, for example, they take surplus weapons and they load each ship with 100 rifles, and then they load a couple of 6 pounders or 12-pound cannons on them. And by later on in the war, there's like a naval 32-pounder going on each ship, and so on. But so they're loading weapons onto these ships, and the ships agree to take them on and use them themselves. They don't have like naval sailors or soldiers on the ships arming them.
Do,
Or
do they have do they have enough crew to actually use that many rifles?
Yeah, so they load on extra crewmen to make sure that they know how to use them. But the other idea was that they'll just give guns to all the passengers as well in the event of an emergency. So, for example, this happens in 1861. So, who's coming from California to the East Coast in 1861? A lot of soldiers. A significant part of the regular army is coming east in 1861, and some big names are traveling on these ships. E. Porter Alexander's on one of these ships. A. Kautz is on one of these ships. Henry Halleck is on one of these ships. Edwin Sumner's traveling on one of these ships. Joseph Hooker. They're all traveling on Winfield Scott Hancock. And basically, they're traveling east on these ships, and there's $1 million or $2 million in gold on each ship as well. And sometimes they're traveling just by themselves as officers, or sometimes they're traveling with a company of soldiers or a battalion of soldiers moving east as well. And at the beginning of the war, basically the ship's captain would go up to the senior officer being transported and say, they would basically say, you need to get your guys organized into a security force for this trip. And they would basically act as an impromptu security force for the duration of the trip in case somebody tried to get at them, because there are Confederate privateers, and there's rumors of even more Confederate privateers being built in Mexico. I found a record of one being built in Delaware, so at least some people claimed, with the specific intention of trying to capture these ships carrying gold.
Wow. And it seems like if you've got, soon to be Confederates riding on those ships like Edward Porter Alexander, like they know that this is going on. And, it's easy for them basically as a security leak to say, hey, look, here's a possibility. I'm going to take a quick break for just a second. I'm going to bring Maxwell James on because he has a question for me. Maxwell James, can you say hi to Neil?
Hi.
Well, he's invisible. Yeah. There he is. Look. Oh, very
Hey.
good. So what you need, pal? It's top secret. So secret he's disappearing off the screen. Well, I can't just ask me. I can't hear you, and you're using up my time. Just tell me. Okay? All right, I'll take care of it in a little bit. All right, very good. All right. He's reminding me that he wants some ice cream for dessert, and so
Perfect.
it's a must, right? It's a must. So it's a
Can't
Friday.
cancel the
We're
rest of
recording
the
this.
interview right
Yeah,
now.
yeah. No, we're recording this on a Friday evening, and he wants me to remember that before he goes to bed.
That's okay. It's important.
Yes, it is. So we were talking about sort of this potential security risk, and this ad hoc way of dealing with it. What's the trigger to maybe formalize this protection system, or how does security step up?
Security steps up after one of them gets captured.
That will do it every time, won't it?
So December 7th, 1862, the Confederate commerce raider Alabama, Raphael Semmes, the most famous of all the commerce raiders, captures one of these ships in the Windward Passage between Cuba and Haiti. The problem for the Confederates is the ship is going south to pick up gold from Panama, not going up to drop it off in New York. So all he's got is passengers. But what he also has on this ship that he captures is about 250 U.S. Marines being transported to California to reinforce the Pacific Naval Squadron. And when he actually sends his ship to capture, he sends a small boat to claim this ship on its way to pick up the gold. The ship's name is Ariel. And the Marines are actually standing in battle formation on the main deck, ready to start shooting at the Confederate ship until basically the captain of the merchant ship tells them to just surrender because they're all going to die because the Confederates have all these cannons and they don't. Ariel at that time has one 9-pounder cannon, which Semmes will capture and then use to help sink USS Hatteras about a month later. But this ship gets captured after a couple of days of the Confederate raider Alabama trying to do circles to try to wait for another treasure steamer to show up with gold. He just releases it on its own recognizance, and it makes its way to Panama and spreads the word. And after this, basically the U.S. government goes, oh my God, they're vulnerable. And every one of these ships in the Atlantic side of this Panama route has to travel through the Windward Passage. It's a major choke point. And so the U.S. Navy stands up the West India Squadron. People know the West India Squadron as the one that hunts the Confederate commerce raiders but never catches any of them. Well, that's only half their mission. The other half of their mission, the orders to their squadron commanders are to literally escort every one of these ships carrying gold through the Windward Passage. Very similar to what's happening in the Bab al-Mandeb Straits in the Red Sea right now with the U.S. Navy escorting ships because of Yemen, straight through the choke point area so that they can protect them through that part.
Wow. So is there an issue where because you said they've got regular schedules. When Semmes captures that ship, is there any danger of the schedule falls into the wrong hands? I mean, can Confederates take that information and target ships because they know when and where they're going?
They already know when and where they're going. The schedules are not secret. They're printed in the New York Times.
Yeah, that's not very secret at all, is it?
it's extremely open because it's not a military operation. It's a business venture essentially. And so they every now and then they change what day the ships leave New York. They leave on the 1st of the month from San Francisco and New York, and then 6 months later they leave on the 5th of the month instead, so to speak. So they alter it every now and then for something like that. But you capture one newspaper and then you're caught up. So right. there is no secrecy with this.
Okay. Now, before we get too far away, I just want to ask you real quick because we've never had the chance to talk about this in a podcast format. What is your assessment of Raphael Semmes?
Very flamboyant, but he knows what he's doing. I mean, he's somebody who has a vision, is able to realize that vision. I would say his biggest fault is he maybe doesn't know when to stop because he lets ego get in the way a little bit. Which is good when you're on the rise and you're capturing all these ships. But, his ego definitely got in the way when he challenged USS Kearsarge in France and then ended up losing his ship as a result because of wear and tear, ruining a lot of his facilities, whereas the U.S. ship was much more ready to fight, so to speak.
Isn't that always the truth? I mean, we could say the same thing about Lee at Gettysburg. It's always going well until suddenly it's not, Yeah,
everybody talks about the artillery shells and the fuses being bad with Lee's army at Gettysburg, causing issues with the bombardments and stuff. So it's the same situations, just on the water.
So the squadron that's protecting these merchant ships with the gold, you say they're pretty successful at that. Do Confederates then shift their strategy and try to find some other way to target these gold shipments?
Yeah. So yes. So in the Confederates in early 1863, that's the time when they're the most successful against this Panama route. So December 1862 to June 1863 it's like a 6-month window where they're very successful. They capture this steamer Ariel in December of 62. In January of 1863, a Confederate privateer named Retribution is sailing back and forth right up in the Bahamas, right along the path of these steamers. The ship doesn't have any engines though, and it's really small, so it can't stop anything. But it sure does scare the U.S. businessmen when they hear another privateer is waiting for them, essentially. March 1863, the Confederates tried to get a privateer out to sea in San Francisco, and it's actually captured as it's trying to depart port in San Francisco. The U.S. Navy and the San Francisco police turn somebody on the crew as a double agent, and they're able to capture the ship as it's leaving. So it's pretty interesting stuff. Those folks are put on trial and sentenced to prison terms under the Second Confiscation Act for violating that, in fact. Um, and then June
That's a
1863. Yeah,
that's a
go
great
ahead.
little. I'll say that's a great little tale of intrigue. That's
Oh,
fascinating. So all right,
oh
I'm
no,
sorry to interrupt you.
it's pretty weird stuff. Nobody talks about Confederate privateers in California at all.
Yeah, yeah.
And then June 1863, CSS Florida, the other most famous of the Confederate commerce raiders, captures a ship packed with about $100,000 in silver. Um, yeah, and then they bring the silver to Bermuda, and then put it on a British ship and send it to England. And then the British element of the firm Fraser Trenholm and Company, which is the Confederates' financing agent in Europe, sends the silver to France, where they melt it down so that they can try to launder it so it can't be traced. But then the French government puts a hold on it because the ship they capture, Benjamin F. Hoxie, is an American flag ship, but the silver is actually from Mexico and it's consigned to a British firm. And so it's neutral cargo. And so the French track it down and then put a hold on it until the court system say, give it back to the British, essentially. So they do capture some of this bullion, but they can't ever use it, so to speak. It's weird.
I think we should start a rumor where they captured the silver, and so they couldn't trace it. They melted it down and they cast it into musical instruments so it wouldn't be traceable. And that's where the idea of the Bermuda Triangle came from. And they
There
had
you
all
go.
these percussion instruments.
That's
Let's
funny.
let's just start that.
So that's pretty good. So that's 1863. 1864, the Confederates shift gears again. They send out a couple of more commerce raiders. That's Chickamauga and Tallahassee. Those are home-built commerce raiders coming out of Wilmington. One steams back and forth between Wilmington and Bermuda. The other steams back and forth between Wilmington and Halifax, Nova Scotia, which crosses right next to New York City, where these ships stop. Um, and so when these Confederate raiders get out, the U.S. Navy has to respond by altering the convoy. Now it's not a convoy through just the Windward Passage. They change the entire system so that it's a full escort from New York City all the way to Panama and all the way back. So the U.S. Navy responded there. At the end of 1864, the Confederates send a team of, well, the best equivalent thing you can come up with is a team of naval special operators, so essentially Navy SEALs of the Confederacy, and they send them to Panama, and they disguise themselves as civilians and board one of these ships as passengers, with the goal of then capturing the ship, and then they all have uniforms on under their jacket, and now they own the ship, sort of a thing, and then they'll ride up the Pacific coastline of this Panama route as one of these treasure ships going back on its return voyage, and then all the ships coming down with gold, well, they'll just run into them and say, "Oh, we need your help," and capture them all one by one by one.
Hmm.
Their stops too. Networked intelligence from the U.S. government's intelligence network is fascinating here. They have U.S. consuls in Panama who find out what's going on. They manage to turn somebody into a double agent again in Cuba, who then says, "I can't go on the trip. I'm sick. Oh no!" And then he informs on the soldiers are receiving intelligence in California, and they're sending the intelligence down to Panama. And the U.S. Navy stops it all from happening and captures these guys. And they actually get sent to San Francisco, and they're put on a military trial by court martial. And Irvin McDowell sentences them to death. And then their sentence is commuted to life in prison, and then they get released in 1866. So that's pretty weird.
Wow. Yeah, particularly if they are like dressed as civilians, that's a hanging offense,
Yeah,
as I
so
suppose.
they have orders from Navy Secretary Stephen Mallory for the Confederacy, but when they're being captured, they like rip up all their orders and commissions and the pieces and stuff like that to try to hide the fact that so that they can maybe pass themselves off as civilians. So it doesn't work out. The Pacific Ocean, they're not convoying these ships though. What they're doing instead is keeping U.S. Navy warships at specific ports where these ships like to touch base to pick up mail and pick up passengers. So they keep U.S. Navy ships at Panama City. In fact, the U.S. Navy's Pacific Squadron, their flagship, stays in Panama City for most of the war. Then they keep ships at Mazatlan, Mexico, Cabo San Lucas, Acapulco sometimes, and then in San Francisco as well. And what's weird is that every time the French start doing something in Mexico, the U.S. Navy ships start reorganizing themselves and they go to different ports for a couple of weeks. Or when the Confederate Army under Henry Sibley goes into New Mexico and they're starting to communicate with the Mexican governments of Chihuahua and Sonora to try to gain favor, all of a sudden one of these U.S. Navy ships shows up in the coastline of Sonora, trying to flex the muscles a little bit and show the U.S. flag. Because that's kind of the other element of this is that the Monroe Doctrine is threatened when the Civil War happens because we're too busy to enforce it, essentially. Everybody thinks that we try to enforce the Monroe Doctrine through the Red River Campaign going into Texas to try to show the French that we mean business. Well, we're also doing it at sea with these ships. U.S. Navy ships are patrolling Mexican ports. U.S. Navy ships are patrolling South American ports on the Pacific coastline, where when Spain tries to declare war, the Chincha Islands War going on down there in 1864, when Spain reconquers Santo Domingo during our Civil War, we have ships patrolling off that coast. We in fact recognize Haiti as a country in 1862, and we basically do it so that we can ask them if we can keep a naval base there, so that we can then use that naval base to support these convoys. So there's a lot going on with this Monroe Doctrine stuff to maintain a U.S. presence as the significant power of North and Central America during the war too.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because I just did a podcast about Hawaii in the American Civil War and the commercial interests there, which, in Hawaii, although neutral, a lot of strong pro-union sentiment there. And the commercial interests were really saying like, hey, we need some protection in case the Confederates really target our commercial routes, which of course they end up doing with the Shenandoah. And the Pacific Fleet is like, we're pretty strung out. We just don't have the ability to do that. So you're kind of filling in the other half of that story that I just got to talk a little bit about the other day.
Yeah, Hawaii did in fact declare neutrality in the war. They issued a statement of neutrality, and Shenandoah had orders after it destroyed the whaling fleet in Alaska to basically sail down to San Francisco and capture these ships full of treasure. Still, but they don't do that because they find out that the war is over by the time they get close to those shipping lanes. So that's kind of where the story ends in the Pacific, is with Shenandoah not doing anything. But you're right. When people hear Shenandoah is moving around, the U.S. Navy sorties its ships to search for it to protect this gold. And in fact, the Pacific Mail Steamship Company sends out its spare ships to search as well in an effort to track it as much as they can because it's that much of a threat to them.
Yeah. So now I want to back up to something you said a second ago when you were sort of talking about how the Confederacy alters its strategies for capturing these gold ships, particularly in the Atlantic. And you said in 1864, they're finally these gold ships are getting full military convoys. Is that coming out of Uncle Sam's pocket, or is that something the businessmen themselves are having to pay for this? Because I'm guessing at that point in the war, as much as the war is costing the U.S. government, there's certainly a national security incentive for the Navy to help out. But I could also see like, we're using tax dollars to pay for a private enterprise. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so earlier in the war, everything was on the financing of the businesses, the shipping companies. If they wanted to train somebody to operate the cannons that were loaned to them, they had to pay for those folks. The Navy offered to commission the captains of these ships as acting volunteer lieutenants in the Navy so that they could hold some sort of unofficial official paperwork from the U.S. government saying they are working with the government in case they were captured by the Confederates to get prisoner of war status, but they would not receive pay. When the Navy starts escorting these ships, however, directly, that's 100% on Uncle Sam's dime. The U.S. Navy pays for these ships completely, and there is no repayment for the transportation by these mail companies that are transporting everything. So the government does take on this role on its own, just like the government took on this role during the Battle of the Atlantic, so to speak.
And I can see the stakes for this getting higher and higher for both sides because, of course, both governments are having to pay for this war, so having hard currency would be really important. And at this point, the Anaconda Plan has choked off pretty much everything for the Confederacy, with a few small exceptions. And so, having some way to get some income would be especially important for them. How are the what are the political ramifications of all of this by 1864 and into 1865?
There's a lot going on there. If you read diaries of people in the North, everybody's tracking the value of gold in New York City. Even Europeans are tracking the value of gold in New York City, and they're using the value of gold in New York City as the baseline for how successful is the war going at this point.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
yeah, so when Confederate military victories happen, the price of gold skyrockets in the United States. Or when word of one of these ships being almost captured happens, the price of gold skyrockets in the United States. And so the U.S. wants to maintain this so that they can keep inflation at bay. So they're financing the war with bonds and with the Legal Tender Act with paper money and everything. But the gold value in New York is what's keeping the inflation rate at bay for the United States. So they give you a couple of statistics here. The U.S. government had $73 million in its treasury in 1861. The Confederacy started the war with $500,000 of gold in its treasury. It would add about $2 million more in gold by the time the New Orleans Mint was captured in 1862, but it ends the war with $500,000 in its treasury. One of these ships carrying gold carries between $500,000 and $3 million per trip, depending on what time of year and the circumstances. So capturing one of these ships will double the Confederacy's treasury. And that's pretty significant in itself. Now, the inflation stuff gets pretty crazy too. So everybody talks about, oh, the Confederacy had rampant inflation and the United States didn't have as much. Well, we actually have charts of the actual month by month inflation rates in both countries. So, for example, in November 1864, when Abraham Lincoln's reelected president, the inflation rate for the United States is that $1 in gold costs $2.33 in paper greenback money. $1 in gold will cost the Confederates $33.50 in paper.
Oh,
So they have no treasury and their inflation rate is rampant. And so the Confederacy is desperate to capture some of these ships. That's why they keep sending more commerce raiders out. And everyone said the commerce raiders are targeting merchant ships. Every single commerce raider and every Confederate warship built in Europe that left Europe had standing orders that included wording to capture these ships. Every single one had orders to capture these ships on site. So it was recognized by the Confederate government as a legitimate target, and it was recognized by them as an important target. And so that's why they keep trying to make these efforts. The problem is nobody knows about it because they never captured any, essentially. And the one they did capture, the silver, never made it to the Confederacy. And so it was kind of pointless.
because they were turned into Bermuda
The
Triangles.
Bermuda Triangles, of course. And I know I'm going crazy with the statistics here, but like getting the feel for that really lets you see just how important this is. I mean, this is part economics. And so seeing the economics in hand with numbers lets you really understand just how pivotal this could be in both sides' military operations.
I mean, and it seems like for the Confederacy, particularly, the stakes are just huge. When you talk about basically a $32 to 1 inflation rate there. I mean, having some sort of hard currency to back up that paper money, you know, at that point in the wars, they're desperate. They're absolutely desperate.
And this is only half the story. The other half of the story is the land side. We talk about the ships, but The Confederacy sends an army into Arizona to conquer New Mexico, to get to Colorado and its gold mines, to get to California. That's the 1862 Sibley, New Mexico campaign. And the United States sends armies to stop them. Those are New Mexico and Colorado and California volunteers stopping them. And then the Confederacy keeps trying to send soldiers into the far west. In 1863, they try to keep coming up with schemes to raise, they keep hearing these rumors that 10,000 Confederates are just sitting in Los Angeles ready to go with guns. If we can just get, 30 officers there for some reason. There's a Confederate agent, an officer, a recruiter that gets all the way to Virginia City, Nevada, where there's a massive amount of silver mines. And basically, he's there at the same time Mark Twain invents his moniker, Mark Twain, while he's silver mining with his brother. And there's Confederate agents trying to recruit so that they can invade more of the far west during this time, while all that's happening at the same time. And then when all the Confederates get ejected from the Southwest, well, the U.S. has all these volunteer soldiers, and what do they do with them? They use them to force indigenous populations to reconcentrate to other locations so that they can open up land for Western mining, and so they can open up land for Abraham Lincoln's vision of a free soil settlement of the West. That's what the Homestead Act and the Morrill Act is all about. So we have the Long March of the Navajo in 1864 by U.S. volunteers who were raised to prevent the Confederacy from getting the gold at mine access in the Southwest. We have the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado in 1864. These things keep happening, and yeah, it is part of the Indian Wars of the West of the latter 19th century. But people say that that part of the Civil War wasn't really part of the Civil War because it's more of the West, but it is linked to Lincoln's political philosophy. It is linked to his ultimate goals for settlement, and he's using volunteers who volunteered to fight the Confederacy to enact those policies. So it is all kind of linked together in a way.
I don't want to spoil anything, but I might suggest that our colleagues Phil Greenwald and Patrick Kelly Fisher are actually putting together a book about the war in the West and about some of these very same things. So there's a little teaser for our listeners about that. So as you dealt with this in your book, and again, going back to the fact that you're a Navy guy, we've got this land component. Why is this hugely important economic story something that most Civil War folks don't know about?
There's just no historiography on it. It doesn't exist. One person's written a book on the Panama Route, and that was in the 1940s. There's one book about the Panama Railroad that came out about 2-3 years ago, and everything else is just a random paragraph here and there in like Raphael Semmes' memoirs about I want to get this gold, and then he never mentions it again after the 2 pages where his memoir talks about trying to capture this ship. Some people have done other work. There's a thesis about the Confederates trying to get to in Panama to capture that ship in Panama, and they get arrested. There's a couple of journal articles about the people in California trying to build a privateer. Nobody's written anything about that silver stuff, though. I think I've basically found that myself. Maybe 1 or 2 other people have written about it, but I haven't found anything about it. But some of the stories just have never really been told. And if they have been told, they've been told in a segregated way, isolated from one another. So this is kind of the first time they're being put together in a real cohesive way where you can understand that there's not just one-off movements, it's a grander narrative, a grander strategy by the Confederates, a grander strategy by the US to maintain these shipping lanes and the wealth that's being transported within them.
So we could really call your book a seminal study.
I'll settle if any of the reviewers just say it's not bad. So
And and the land aspect of this has been covered a little bit, and I'll point folks to the 2021 winner of the Emerging Civil War Book Award, Megan Kate Nelson's The Tri-Cornered War, which talks a lot about, the U.S. government, the Confederate government, and the indigenous people sort of fighting it all out there in that corner of the continent as all this is going on. But the Navy stuff is really unexplored. So this is, to me, it's really cool that you have uncovered this story that really does have a lot to do with the financial underpinnings of everything that's going on for both sides.
yeah, so I'll freely admit that the historiography of the far west in the war is fantastic. It's been great for the last 30 years. There's been book after book after book, and thank goodness, because I was able to use all those resources to add to my story to kind of tie everything together. So my hope with this book was to take all that historiography for the last 30 years, synthesize it into something that's readable for maybe someone who doesn't want to read 20 books about it, and merge it with this naval element that nobody's really talked about to provide this bigger, grander, cohesive narrative that adds some originality that people don't have much experience with.
So I'm going to invite you to hold the book cover up so we can see it again, just to remind folks. Yeah.
So
Treasure and Empire in the Civil War. Now,
yeah.
I'm going to put you on the spot here for a second, Neil, because one of the things that I think was so cool about this whole conversation is like you would just whip up these statistics and like, oh, I just happen to have them here. So
I mean,
what
I
statistics?
do.
Yeah, okay. So what statistics do you have that you haven't had the chance to use yet?
So I can tell you that the statistic I can tell you is that there were 151 trips made transporting gold by the Atlantic and Pacific Steamship Company from Cologne, Panama to New York City during the war. They transported $198 million in gold and silver during the war, which is the equivalent of $5.8 billion today.
That was
Which
going to be, yeah, that was my next question.
Oh yeah, so $5.8 billion today would make just the ships carrying gold during the Civil War the 43rd or 44th most wealthy country in the world today.
Wow.
Um, and 151 trips, 87 of those trips are convoyed, either in part or in whole, and 64 of them are not convoyed because it's earlier in the war. So it's pretty crazy with some of that stuff. And the U.S. Navy only devotes 12 warships to this convoy during the entire war.
Wow.
And they just rotate them back and forth and send one back to New York for repairs and another one comes down. But it's only about 12 that actually do the escorting throughout the war. So it's kind of bang for your buck, so to speak,
Okay.
in the grand scheme of things.
So when the war ends, what happens to this financial route?
It continues. It becomes less important in 1869 with the Transcontinental Railroad being completed in the United States, but this Panama route still exists. I mean, the Panama Railroad still operates today, and the equivalent today would be cruise ships going through from the east coast of the U.S. to the west coast of the U.S. for fun, not for transport, obviously, because of modern day technology with the airplanes and cars and stuff, but this route still does exist. It's not as important today, but the Panama Canal is definitely important today. And this plants the seeds for U.S. involvement to continue to that Panama Canal because we've got a U.S. business running the railroad. We've got U.S. ships running the transportation network. And the city, Cologne, Panama, was essentially built by the United States and its representatives. In fact, we called it Aspinwall instead of Cologne. And there was a fight for 30 years over what was the name of the town. And the only reason it's called Cologne today is because the Colombian government, because Panama at that time is part of Colombia, they refused to deliver mail if the town name was Aspinwall in the letter, and they would just throw the letter in the trash.
It was a post office thing, as I recall. Yeah.
That resolved the conflict, and so today the town's name is still Cologne, Panama. So there's a lot going on there. It's pretty interesting, weird factoid stuff, but when you merge it all together, it makes this really interesting story.
As I recall, and this sort of starts the conversations about the Panama Canal, which takes decades to finally resolve. I'll point people to David McCullough's book, The Path Between the Seas, which is sort of the history of the Panama Canal. And at first, I'm like, why do I want to read a book about this? This sounds terrible. And after reading that book, like I resolved that I would read the phone book if David McCullough wrote it. I mean, it was such a well-written, fascinating book. And so the story you're telling sort of sets up what happens with the eventual creation of the canal.
Yeah, so this sets up a lot of things. We're presaging Alfred Thayer Mahan and his ideas of overseas naval bases with the U.S. base in Haiti and with U.S. ships guarding Latin American countries, essentially. We're presaging U.S. expansion because some of the places that we're guarding are guano islands taken over control of by the U.S. Guano Islands Act in the 1850s. And then we're going to use that law just a couple years later to seized Midway Island and the Hawaiian island chain just after the war. We're presaging the Panama Canal, and so there's a lot of hints here, and so all of it builds up into the late 19th century uh, push by like Theodore Roosevelt and the Spanish American War and the big stick policy and the dollar diplomacy policy by Taft. And so this really does set the stage of those policies didn't come from nowhere. Those policies are a direct result of U.S. business and political interventions in Latin America just before and during the Civil War.
I'll tie this back to Hawaii again too, because I still have Hawaii on the mind. But that's what sends John Schofield out, and he makes a recommendation under this very same stuff you're talking about to establish that military base at Pearl Harbor.
Absolutely. It's all kind of tied together. And this just plants the seeds for a lot of that late 19th century American empire, American overseas imperialism standpoint.
Wow. So it really is sort of this, set up to the age of American imperialism, which is a whole nother chapter, but fascinating stuff. So Neil, any final comments I haven't asked you about? Anything I should have?
No, I think it's pretty good. I'll just say for a final sort of closing remark here that the stakes could not have been higher with this. So we're talking about the financial stability of the United States in the middle of its Civil War. We're talking about the financial credibility of the Confederacy being established in the first place with all this gold transportation, and with all the land routes being fought over, and with the shipping lanes being fought over in Latin America. We're not just talking about wealth now. The book is also touching on whoever wins this war, the United States or Confederacy. Not only are they going to be economically dominant because of all the wealth that they're going to physically have with these mines and transportation networks, it's also who's going to become the dominant power in the Americas as a result, because the country that wins these shipping lanes, the country that dominates these shipping lanes and dominates these mines in the West and these lands in the West, is going to become the dominant power in North America and thus the Americas after the Civil War.
Yeah. So the book is called Treasure and Empire in the Civil War, the Panama Route, the West, and the campaigns to control America's. Oh, wait, I lost
mineral wealth.
Okay, mineral wealth. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now I have to say, like the little phrase "mineral wealth" at the end is not that exciting. But boy, like if you just said like capture the ships full of gold, like
I know.
sign me up, man.
I know. I should have just said like it's gold, but not one of those made up stories. And that, but like.
That's right. This is not one of those fictitious stories of mythological Confederate gold. This is real stuff.
Yeah, everything here is reality. There is no fictitious mythology in any of it. It's all hard, physical, actual gold, silver, copper, mineral wealth that everybody's fighting over. It's pretty interesting stuff.
Wow. This has been fantastic. Thanks so much for chatting tonight, Neil.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Oh, fantastic. I'm Chris Mikowski. Thanks for being with Neil and I tonight. We really enjoyed having you with us. We will see you online and on the battlefield.